So let's just conclude our lectures on the types of scientific questions by focusing on some common misunderstandings. Remember, we have this flowchart that tells us which type of statistical question we're trying to answer. And by answering these questions, you can figure out which of the 6 types a particular medical paper is focused on. But there are a lot of confusions about the different types of analyses that are being done, and it's really common to mix them up. The most famous example, of course, is that correlation implying causation. So what does correlation implying causation actually mean? This is the case where if you did an inferential analysis, you observed some data, you saw some relationships, you're trying to say, does that relationship between variables hold in the bigger population? That's a correlation. But the paper might be saying something like, well, there's a correlation between, say, a particular treatment and whether somebody had a disease or not. It isn't saying, if we give you that treatment, you will definitely get better in terms of this disease. That's a causal question, and you have to use different techniques to answer it. So this mix-up between inferential and causal is an example of one of the common misunderstandings. So this is correlation does not imply causation. Another really common mix-up is to think that you're doing an inferential analysis, but to actually be doing an exploratory analysis. In other words, you report something that you say holds in the broader population, but you actually looked at dozens of different relationships. You weren't really quantifying carefully what actually the uncertainty behind those relationships was. You're actually just kind of exploring the data, but you make a claim about what's happening in the larger population. This is an example of data dredging, and you hear about that especially with respect to multiple comparisons or the garden of forking paths. Another common mistake is to look at exploratory analysis and think that you're doing a predictive analysis. So you have a bunch of data, especially for high dimensional data. You're looking at all these different variables and you're saying some subset of these variables might be predictive. If you're not careful about separating the part where you're exploring from the part where you're building a predictive model, you might get an analysis that, sure, the exploration looks like there's a relationship, but the predictive model actually doesn't work very well. So this is usually called overfitting. It's a kind of data analysis where you did a lot more exploration than you should have in the data, and you weren't careful enough in building your predictive model. A final example of a mix-up between the type of questions is you think that you're doing an inferential analysis, but you're actually doing a descriptive analysis. So this is the example where you look at a case report or you look at an N of 1 study and you say, we're going to infer something about the entire population of patients that have this characteristic from this one sample. Since you only have one sample, it's very hard to say anything about the population at all. So these sort of N of 1 analyses are when you're mixing up a descriptive and an inferential analysis. Of course, there's other types of mistakes that are possible, but these are the most common ones that you see when people are describing papers in the medical literature. These question errors also get propagated when the news covers medical stories, where they often mix up studies that are preliminary or exploratory with studies that are confirmatory or causal questions. So now you know a little bit about the different types of scientific questions. So when you pick up your next medical research paper, especially one that's looking at data, you can use this flowchart to figure out what kind of question they're answering and so what standard